that people perhaps have. Perhaps they're questions you have had. Perhaps there are questions you currently are having. Or maybe they're questions that other people have asked of you. Questions that at times can cause a struggle. Perhaps even present a critique in terms of what we believe as Christians. And so one of the values we hold on to is the fact that it's okay to have questions. It's okay to be uncertainty. It's okay to question what it is we believe, because we believe that in having these questions, it hopefully creates conversation where we can begin to learn more about not only who God is, but ultimately what God wants for all of us. And so my hope is that this has been a series that has perhaps opened up greater conversations, perhaps caused us to consider points of views that we may have or have not had. My hope is that we'll come back to series like this down the road, where we continue to ask questions, continue to explore what it means to not only follow Jesus, so that he's not just simply someone we talk about, but ultimately he's the one that we live all of life with. So if you happen to miss us on a Sunday morning, I realize the last couple of weeks, weather has not been on our side. It's been great that the roads were not completely treacherous. And so you could be with us here this morning. But if you did miss us, or if we miss you in the coming weeks, just know you can always track online as well. You can just jump onto our website, click on Watch Sunday's message, and you can get caught up to speed in terms of everything that has been said and where we're going. Next week, we're going to start a new series that's going to carry us into Easter. And it's called Encounters with Jesus. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to turn to some rather interesting encounters that Jesus had with people in the midst of all of life. Because what I start to notice is that when you start to read the Bible and you start to read the way in which God speaks into people's lives, it often comes in rather subtle ways. It oftentimes comes in moments where I'm sure the person woke up in the morning and did not think, I am going to have a profound, life-changing moment with God. No, they probably woke up thinking, I'm going to have Cheerios or whatever they ate way back then, and I'm just going to go about my daily business. And then God stepped into their lives and something significant happened. And so we're going to look at some of these stories, but not just from a historical perspective, but from a place of saying, okay, how does this then translate into my life as well? How do I begin to look for these opportunities that I believe that God is placing before us to profoundly change us and transform us? And so we hope that you'll continue to join us as we get closer and closer to Easter. But this morning we're going to wrap up our series. And it's been a series where we have been looking at various questions that oftentimes have dealt with statements of belief, things that we believe. And there's times where people are kind of hesitant of the church or hesitant of following Jesus because of the claims that Jesus makes. But this morning, we're going to look at an issue within the life of the church, within the life of Christianity. And I'm going to hedge a bet and say it's an issue that we all deal with as well. But it's an issue that oftentimes prevents people from really wanting to take that next step. Whether that next step is to go to church or come back to church, or whether that next step is to pursue who Jesus really is. And one word: hypocrisy. I'm sure you've heard it. I'm sure you've said it. I'm sure maybe you're sitting in that place right now where you're thinking, why would I want to go to church? Why would I want to hear about this guy Jesus? Because all I see are a bunch of hypocrites. They believe one thing, they say one thing, but then they do something completely different. And so this morning's question is simply, I have a friend who believes the church is full of hypocrites. And so there's two ways I can answer this. I can answer this real quickly and have you at the line in Swiss Chalet before anyone else gets led out of church. Or I can give you the extended answer. Why don't we do both? The quick answer and make a run for the doors. I'll turn my back. I won't look. I won't judge. Too much. The church is filled with hypocrites. Yes, absolutely. That's the reality. That's the reality that we face. That's the reality that we live with. This idea that there is this gap. There is this tension that we hold on to, whereby we believe and we desire to live in a certain way. This, what we'll refer to as the ideal me, right? I'm sure for all of you, for me, there's the ideal Joel. There's the ideal husband. There's the ideal dad. There is the ideal friend. There is the ideal pastor, right? You're thinking that image right now, what the ideal pastor is right now? Someone just pointed at Stan Cox. There we go. That's awesome. I'll let Stan come up and finish the message because I agree with that as well. This is just a long intro. And then there's the real me. Right? There's the real Joel. There's the real husband. There's the real dad. I'm not accepting any more comments at this point, just so you know. And there's this tension, there is this gap between who I want to be and who I actually am. And I think for so many of us, regardless of what you believe, I think you probably live with that sense of tension. Whether you are a follower of Jesus or not, you probably have in your mind an ideal version of who you would be, and then the reality of who you are. And if you don't think that's the case, then just give the nudge to the person next to you, and they'll set you straight. But why does that happen so often in the church? Why is it so often that we see in the church that we try to present only the ideal me when in the fact is everyone else sees the real you? And I think part of the problem is not the fact that we mess up, not the fact that we fail to live up, but the fact that we don't own up to the mistakes that we commit in the midst of life. I see this with my kids oftentimes, and if you have little ones, or maybe you have a spouse who acts like a little one at times, something goes wrong. You see something's been broken, something has been damaged, something has gone wrong, and you go in and you ask, what has happened? What is going on? And instead of actually hearing what has happened, there's like this elaborate backstory as to everything else that happened and everything else that went on. And by the time you finally get to what went wrong, you're like, good Lord, you should have just started with that. That is so not the issue. But now I have to deal with all this other backstory because that's so often the issue. And I think when people claim that the church is full of hypocrites, it's not so much just a judgment, it's a desire that people want. It's authenticity. It's people truly being real in the midst of all of life. Because people, I think, are oftentimes drawn to Jesus. They may not always like and agree everything that he says and the statements that he makes, but people are drawn to Jesus. And what is truly sad is oftentimes what prevents people from getting to him or getting to know him even more is the fact that those who claim to follow him spend so much time trying to cover up all the mistakes and the blemishes in life that people get turned off. Because you know who dislikes hypocrites in the church even more than anyone in this room or outside this room? It's Jesus himself. If you know a little bit about Jesus and you know a little bit of his ministry, you see the people that he often got into greatest tension with were the religious folk, the leaders of what would be kind of the present day church. Because they were always trying to appear one way when in reality they lived another. They were always trying to be impressive to others. A little bit of extra reading this week if you want to go there. In Matthew chapter 6, and then Matthew chapter 23. There's these two accounts where Jesus is teaching and Jesus is going at the religious leaders. And over and over again, he calls them hypocrites. He calls them hypocrites. Even though he may acknowledge some of the good things that they are doing, he is recognizing their hypocrisy. He's recognizing the fact that they are saying one thing, they are behaving in one way, but then they're actually living in another way entirely. And Jesus just cannot tolerate it anymore. Because Jesus understands what's at stake. He understands the impact that hypocrisy has not only on us, but upon others as well. You see, Jesus is so concerned with hypocrisy because it has an impact upon our lives and upon our faith, upon our relationship with him. I mean, think of any relationship that you have with someone who is significant in your life. You want to know who they really are, right? Think about it when you're first starting to date someone. Some of us may have to go back a little bit further than others, but memory will not fail. You go back, you present yourself in a certain way, and you present all the good sides of yourself, but then there comes a time when suddenly the real you starts to come out, and something amazing happens. That even when the real you starts to come out, the person still wants to be with you. It begins to speak to the depth of that relationship. But if you've been in a relationship or you're in a relationship and it's constantly just this appearance and setting aside who the real you is, it's so unhelpful. That relationship will never grow and will never develop in the midst of it. And so hypocrisy, Jesus just wants nothing to do with, because he cannot truly have a relationship with us if we continually present this front. But hypocrisy goes even deeper than that. It has an impact upon those around us as well. They see kind of the lie we're living. They see our inability to kind of own up to what's going on. And as a result, they really want nothing to do with God either. And so Jesus so often deals with it head on. And so this morning, for me anyways, I think the tension isn't, do I have hypocrisy in my life? Do I have issues in my life? But rather, how do I mind the gap? How do I deal with the tension of recognizing that I don't always behave in the way I want to? That the things that I hold on to in terms of belief, in terms of recognizing that Jesus has called us to be loving and forgiving and generous, and to not be envious and to not become easily angered, isn't always a reality in my life. And so how do I respond? I thought of some of the ways that I tend to respond in my life. The first one is just kind of deny it. Just kind of deny it. I don't have a problem. I don't have issues in my life. You know, you kind of start to present a false self. But the problem with that is that everyone else sees it except you. It's kind of like going to the gym or going for a run or working out and getting incredibly sweaty and hot and stinky. And then you think by just like throwing on a little bit of deodorant, you can then head out for dinner and no one else is going to notice, right? You think you've masked the odor and you think you're good to go. And the deodorant companies are great at this. They've picked up on this, I hope you've noticed, because they've gone from like the roll-on to the spray, right? So now you can sometimes like exchange a shower for like the full body spray. Okay, you probably didn't come to church to hear this, but you ain't fooling anybody. Right? Jump in the shower and rinse some of the stank off, right? That's what you need to do. You can't deny it because you may think that it's working for you, but it's not working for anyone else, and it turns them off. And the same is true when we deny the issues in our lives. Well, so maybe we don't deny them. We just try to distract the issues in our life. You know, sometimes I've chosen to distract. And what you see when you're trying to distract people from your issues, you become judgmental of other people. you play this compare-contrast game. You know, have you ever been called out on something? You don't need to raise your hands, people. It's okay. We're all good. You know, have you ever been called out on something and you're suddenly like, oh yeah, well, I have an issue, but you should see what they did, right? You try to distract, you try to point it back towards someone else, and you try to distract and you try to disorient and you try to get the focus off of yourself, but by putting the focus on others, it doesn't actually change what's going on in your life. And too often, this has been a tactic within the church. We try to distract people. We try to focus on other people and the issues that they're experiencing without ever owning our own. A third option, and this is an option that so often we want to go down, is that of just try harder. You know, I'll just try harder. I will just do better. And it may work for a season. It may work for a moment. It may work for like the season of Lent. You know, we just entered into the season of Lent, and this is often a time where someone will focus on an issue or something in their life, and it's an opportunity. But then once Easter comes, it's like, all right, I'm off the clock. I'm back at it again, right? And you try harder, but it doesn't seem to work. You see, Christianity is not a deny it. It's not a distract it. It's not a try harder type of faith. There's something far greater. And so this morning what we're going to do is we're going to jump into the Bible. We're going to turn to a passage, John chapter 8. Heather's going to come up and read that for us here this morning. And we're going to read this passage, and then we're just going to come back and unpack it a little bit more, because if Christianity is not a deny it, not a distract it, not a try harder faith, then what is the answer? And I believe the words are found in this encounter that Jesus has.
John 8, 1-11. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." May God bless his holy word.
Now that may be a passage, that may be a story that you're somewhat familiar with, but to kind of set the scene, Jesus is gone to the temple. And so it would be like a modern day version of us being here at church. And as Jesus is about to get up to teach, people have gathered around, right? People are coming to listen and to hear what he's about to say. And suddenly there is like a bit of commotion, or there's a ruckus coming from the back, right? Now, I'm sure like all of you, you'd be real polite, right? And if something happens in the back, you don't look back, although every bone in your body wants to be like, just do one of those quick looks, see what's going on, right? You're dying to look in the back left corner to see what's happening over there right now. Holy smokes, look at that, right? But you don't, because you're polite and you're looking at me. But then over time, the commotion gets greater and greater and greater, and suddenly people are looking behind them and they're doing they just can't take their eyes off the situation, right? Because what's in the back of the church is pretty much a naked woman. That's what they brought to Jesus. that the religious leaders have shown up to church early and have brought with them a naked woman. Maybe she had like a little cloth wrapped around her, but maybe not, right? John is telling us his story. And here is this woman brought by the religious leaders, and there would have been a huge commotion. Clearly, whatever Jesus was about to teach, that's going to be talked about next week, because now we have to deal with this. And they bring the woman to Jesus, and they tell him straight up, we have caught this woman in the act of adultery. Which you got to kind of pause for a moment and think, like, these aren't just like accusations they're throwing out there. They literally caught the woman in the act of adultery, right? They must have barged into the room, pulled her out, maybe gave her a sheet, and marched her to church. You think you're not well dressed this morning? Got news for you. You weren't as bad as that, right? Totally unexpected. A couple questions I'd like to ask is, where was the guy in the midst of all of this? Why wasn't he dragged off to church? But here's the woman brought to Jesus, and they lay it out. They say, according to the law of Moses, this woman should be stoned. That was the law. People caught in the act of adultery were to be stoned to death. You know what's really sad? There's multiple things that are sad about this story. But the fact is that these religious leaders, these people who are supposedly living a life in an attempt to honor God, would completely and utterly humiliate a person just to try to get at Jesus. They would try to use someone else. That, yeah, what she was doing was not cool with God. But do you think what they were doing was any better? And they bring her to Jesus, demanding an answer. And Jesus stoops down, and he begins to just write in the sand. You know, I wish John, who would be telling us this story, was a little bit closer to Jesus, and he could have peered over his shoulder and told us what Jesus was writing in the sand. Like, who knows what he was writing? Nobody knows what he was writing, but it might have been something incredibly interesting. But anyways, Jesus is writing in the sand. And we're told that the religious people are now really, really getting annoyed at Jesus, because he's clearly not answering them. Maybe he's trying to buy time. He's trying to figure out, but he's not answering them. And so finally Jesus straightens up and is like, listen, you want to throw stones? Whoever has no sin, throw a stone. And then he drops back down to his doodling in the sand. And then eventually, we're told the older ones first, maybe because they were wiser, or maybe because they just realized they had more stuff hidden away in their closet than others, they started to walk away. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read this story, when I hear this story, I immediately jump to the end when Jesus then has a conversation with the woman. For years, that's how quickly I would go. But I realized that in the midst of that, I was missing something so significant. Do you notice Jesus never asked these people to leave? Notice he didn't get all confrontational with the religious leaders and say, you just get out of my presence. How dare you do something like this? This is absolutely disgusting. Why would you do something like this? No, he never asked them to leave, yet they went on their own. And this is such a crucial moment, because they were about to miss out on how Jesus was going to handle the situation. You see, it goes back to the earlier issue that hypocrisy is so dangerous, because it not only impacts others, it impacts our lives as well. And when we have hypocrisy in our lives that we're not willing to deal with, we too often walk away from Jesus before we allow him to be at work in the situation in our lives. Maybe there's some of you here this morning that have walked away from the church, that have walked away from God because of the hypocrisy of those who claim to follow him. Let me just say, it's so great that you've come back, that you're here this morning, that it's an opportunity for you, because one of the dangers in all of life is that we walk away from Jesus too quickly before we see what he is about to do next. Because then Jesus then looks at the woman and asks her, where have they all gone? Where is everybody? Clearly, no one was ready to throw a stone. And then Jesus says these incredible words. He says, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin." Do you notice what Jesus did? He didn't say, "Don't worry about it. Just deny it." He says, "I'm not going to condemn you, but I also want something far better for you." You see, Christianity is not a deny it, is not a distract it, is not a try harder. It is a confess it and then leave it. It is the incredible reality of grace. This unmerited gift, this gift that we don't deserve, yet God so graciously gives to us. And it is grace that changes lives. It is grace that brings about transformation. It is grace that enables us to realize the life that God calls us to live. But grace is so often so hard to receive that so often it begins to prevent us, and it causes us to become more judgmental of others when we fail to receive it. It causes us, when we fail to receive it, to deny what is going on in our lives. And yet that's what Jesus wants for us. He wants us to own it, to confess it, to admit it, but then to receive the grace that he desires for us to hold on to in the midst of all of life. One of the lessons I'm trying to learn is that following Jesus is not about being impressive. It's about being impressed by him. You see, the day that I try to be impressive, whether it's as a dad or as a father, as a pastor, as whatever it is, when I try to be impressive, then when things suddenly don't start to go my way, I need to find another plan to cover it up. But when my life is less about being impressive and more about being impressed by the grace of God, impressed by the love of God, then suddenly my response is not only to desire to follow him more, but to draw others to him as well. To bring people to Jesus, not to be judged and condemned, but to be loved and forgiven. And so what's our next step? I would suggest we kind of fall into one of two camps here this morning. Those of us who have come to that place of saying, you know what, I follow Jesus. I want more of Jesus in my life. I'm going to give you an image here this morning that I hope doesn't cause you not to want to eat lunch here this morning, but I'll do it anyways. Now people are listening. Don't be a stinky Christian. Don't be a Christian that just tries to spray on the deodorant or the perfume and just try to get rid of the stank in your life that really everyone else can see except you. Own it. And then leave it. You see, there's a word within Christianity that we don't often like to talk a whole lot about, and that's confession. Right? This idea of confessing our sins and of repenting of what we've done wrong, but it's such a necessary step because it enables us to get closer to God as we hand over our junk and our messes in life, and it enables us to draw others closer to Jesus. Because suddenly it's not about trying to be impressive. There's a prayer that I continually come back to. It's Psalm 139, verses 23 and 24. It's a prayer that simply says, "Search me, O Lord, and know my heart. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me to life everlasting." It's just coming before God and saying, "God, if there is stuff in my life that I need to deal with, can you show that to me today?" It's not always an easy process. It's a humbling process. But it's a grace-filled process. Maybe this week, these are just simply the words that you offer to God. Simply to say, "Search me. You know my heart. Reveal to me what is offensive to you," because if it's offensive to you, God, it's most certainly offensive to others. And I think more people will be drawn to Jesus, not by how impressive we appear, but by how honest and authentic and how necessary we reveal the reality of Jesus in our lives. Or maybe there's some of you here this morning that is not ready to take that step. You're still cautious about Jesus and Christianity. Can I just simply say this? Don't leave the scene too early. I'm not denying that there's hypocrisy in the church. I'm not denying that there's hypocrisy in my life. But don't leave too soon. Stay around. In the midst of the mess, in the midst of the brokenness, to see what Jesus can do when we truly give our lives over to him. Because he can make a difference. He will make a difference. And the fact that there's broken people at church kind of reminds me that this grace thing is actually working. Because if you notice the people who were drawn to Jesus, it was not the people who said they had it all figured out. Those were the people who had no time for Jesus. And so is there hypocrisy in the church? Yeah, absolutely. But we'd love for you to join us as we continue to figure out what a grace-filled life looks like, where we spend less time trying to be impressive and more time being impressed by Jesus and his gift of life, his gift of grace. Let's pray together.